Hey guys, tonight we begin with the utterly questionable hygiene habits of the Victorian era. A time of top hats, corsets, and diseases with names that sound like rejected Harry Potter spells. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you had passed a well-dressed Victorian lady on a London street in 1860, you would have seen something that looked, from a distance, immaculate. A high lace collar, buttoned to the throat. A skirt sweeping the pavement without a visible stain. Gloves pulled tight over every finger. Skin dusted pale with powder, hair pinned into place with an almost architectural precision. She would have looked, in every sense that the eye could measure, clean. And that is exactly the problem. Because the eye, it turns out, was the only sense the Victorians had learned to satisfy. Beneath that collar, her skin had likely not touched water in longer than you would want to imagine. Beneath those gloves, her nails may have carried the same grime as a laborer's, simply hidden better. Beneath that swept skirt, hemmed to drag along cobblestones slick with mud, manure, and the runoff of a city with no real sewers, the fabric was doing exactly what fabric does in that environment, absorbing everything. This is the strange, uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of the entire Victorian era. It was a century absolutely obsessed with the appearance of cleanliness, and yet, by nearly every modern standard, one of the dirtiest periods in the history of the Western world. Not because people didn't care, not because they were lazy or ignorant or careless with themselves, but because the tools, the science, and even the basic infrastructure required to actually be clean simply did not exist yet, not for most people, and not in the way we understand it today. Think about what clean requires, if you strip it down to its most basic parts. You need water, a lot of it, and it needs to be reasonably free of the things that make people sick. You need somewhere for waste to go once it leaves the body, somewhere that isn't the street outside your window or the well you drink from. You need a way to heat water without burning half a day's wages in coal. You need soap that doesn't strip your skin raw, and you need to understand, on some basic level, why any of this matters in the first place, why washing your hands does something, rather than being just another social ritual, like tipping your hat. The Victorians had almost none of this. Not fully, not reliably, and not for the vast majority of the population living in the era's booming, overcrowded cities. What they had instead was appearance. And appearance, as it turns out, is a very different thing from hygiene. But for over half a century, it was the only version of cleanliness that most people could realistically achieve. Picture London in the 1850s, at the very height of its imperial confidence. The city was the largest in the world, home to over 2 million people, and growing at a pace that had completely outstripped its infrastructure. Streets that had been laid out for a much smaller population now carried an almost unimaginable volume of human and animal waste. Horses, the primary form of transport for goods and people alike, produced tons of manure daily, left to sit in the streets until it was either washed away by rain or ground into paste beneath thousands of boots and wheels. Add to that the waste from humans themselves, much of it emptied directly into cesspits beneath houses, gutters running along the sides of streets, and rivers that served simultaneously as sewer, water source, and industrial dumping ground. And you begin to understand the environment that cleanliness was expected to survive in. And yet, remarkably, Victorian society developed one of the strictest, most elaborate codes of personal presentation that any culture had ever produced. This was the era of the starched shirt collar, changed daily even by men who could not afford to bathe daily. It was the era of white gloves worn specifically because they showed dirt instantly, a kind of visible proof of respectability. If your gloves stayed white through a day of errands, it meant you hadn't touched anything unseemly, hadn't shaken a hand that carried grime, hadn't done manual labor. It was the era of elaborate hairstyles that could take hours to arrange and were sometimes left untouched, unwashed, for a week or more at a time, held together with pomades and pins rather than water. This obsession with visible cleanliness had less to do with vanity than with survival, a specifically social kind of survival. In a century increasingly defined by rigid class distinctions, Appearance became one of the primary languages people used to signal where they belonged. A clean collar said, "I am not a laborer." Pale, powdered skin said, "I do not work outdoors." Gloved hands said, "I do not touch what the poor must touch." Cleanliness, or at least its visible performance, had become a currency, and like any currency, people spent enormous effort trying to appear as though they had more of it than they did. But here is where the story gets genuinely strange, and where it starts to reward the patience of anyone willing to sit with it a little longer. Because underneath this elaborate performance of cleanliness, actual physical hygiene, the kind involving water, soap, and the human body, was in a state that would horrify almost anyone alive today. And the gap between the two, between the visible performance and the invisible reality, is not a minor historical footnote. It is the key that unlocks almost everything else about how Victorians lived, got sick, raised children, fell in love, worked, and died. Consider something as simple as bathing. Today, most of us bathe or shower daily, sometimes more than once, without a second thought. It is so automatic that we rarely consider what it would take away if it disappeared. But for a working-class Victorian family living in a single rented room in a city tenement, a full bath might happen once a week, if that. Water had to be hauled, often from a shared pump or well down the street, sometimes queued for behind a dozen other households doing the same. It then had to be heated over a coal or wood fire, a fuel expense that many families simply could not spare on something as seemingly optional as washing. A single basin of hot water might then be shared among an entire family, the cleanest member bathing first, the water growing progressively colder and dirtier with each subsequent person, right down to the youngest child, who often bathed last in water that had already washed 4 or 5 other bodies. Call it arithmetic rather than neglect. When water costs labor, and labor costs time, and time costs wages, and wages are already stretched thin across rent, food, and coal, bathing becomes something rationed like everything else, not a daily ritual, but a weekly negotiation. And this is where the story begins to widen, because bathing was only the most obvious piece of a much larger puzzle. Every part of the Victorian hygiene experience, the water people drank, the clothes they wore, the teeth in their mouths, the waste that left their bodies, the diseases that swept through their neighborhoods, was shaped by this same underlying tension. A society that understood, on some intuitive level, that cleanliness mattered, colliding again and again with a physical world that made real cleanliness almost impossible to achieve. What makes this story worth telling slowly, chapter by chapter, is that each piece connects to the next in ways that feel almost inevitable once you see them laid out. The water shortage explains the bathing habits. The bathing habits explain the reused clothing. The reused clothing explains the lice and the itching and the endless folk remedies sold in every chemist shop. The lack of understanding about disease explains why cholera outbreaks were blamed on bad smells rather than contaminated water, sending city officials chasing the wrong enemy for decades. And underneath all of it sits the class divide, because while a poor family in the East End of London might bathe once a week in shared, cooling water, a wealthy family in the West End might have 3 or 4 servants whose entire job was hauling, heating, and disposing of bathwater on a near-daily basis, allowing their employers a version of cleanliness that most of the population could not have imagined. This is the world we are about to step into. Not the polished world of period dramas, with their gleaming china and perfectly pressed linens, but the world underneath it, the world of shared basins and reused water, of powder covering unwashed skin, of gloves worn specifically because they hid what was beneath the fingernails. It is a world where cleanliness was not a given, not a background assumption the way it is for most of us today, but something fought for, planned around, and rationed, day after day, by nearly everyone alive. And once you understand that, once you understand just how much effort it took simply to appear clean in an era when actually being clean was, for most people, nearly out of reach, the rest of the story starts to make a different kind of sense. The elaborate rituals, the strange remedies, the class anxieties written into every stitch of lace, and every pair of white gloves. None of it was excess. All of it was adaptation, born from a world without running water, without soap that everyone could afford, without any real understanding of what was making people sick. So let's begin at the most basic point of all, the place every question about cleanliness eventually has to start. Not soap, not bathing, not fashion, water. Where it came from, how far it had to travel, and what, exactly, was hiding inside it by the time it reached a Victorian home. Here is a question that sounds almost too simple to ask, and yet holds the entire foundation of this story inside it. Where did Victorian water actually come from? Not from a tap. Not from a faucet you could turn with one hand while thinking about something else entirely. For the vast majority of the 19th century, especially in its first half, water was something you went and got. It was something you carried in buckets, over distances that could stretch several streets, sometimes queuing behind neighbors doing exactly the same thing, sometimes waiting your turn at a single shared pump that served an entire block of housing. To understand Victorian hygiene, you first have to understand this one unglamorous fact: water was labor. It was heavy, it was time-consuming, and it was, in a very literal sense, expensive, not always in coin, but always in effort. And anything that costs effort gets rationed. This single fact ripples outward into nearly every decision Victorians made about washing themselves, their clothes, their homes, and their food. In the early decades of the century, before any centralized water systems existed in most cities, households relied on a patchwork of sources. Some had access to a private well, usually shared among several families in denser urban housing. Others relied on public pumps, positioned at intervals along streets, drawing from underground sources that were, more often than anyone realized at the time, dangerously close to sources of contamination. Still others depended on water carriers, workers who hauled water from rivers, wells, or public pumps and sold it door to door, a trade that existed specifically because so many households had no reliable water source of their own. And then there was the river itself. In London, that meant the Thames, a river that served, almost unbelievably by modern standards, as drinking source, industrial dumping ground, and waste receptacle all at once. Factories discharged their runoff into it. Slaughterhouses drained blood and animal remains into it. And, perhaps most significantly, human waste from a growing number of households flowed into it as well, particularly as an invention that seemed, at the time, like an unambiguous improvement in cleanliness began spreading through wealthier homes: the flush toilet. This is one of the strange ironies buried inside the Victorian story, and it's worth pausing on, because it defies the way we usually think about progress. The flush toilet, when it began appearing in the homes of the wealthy in the early to mid-19th century, was seen as a triumph of hygiene. No more chamber pots sitting in bedrooms. No more waste accumulating in cesspits beneath the house. A single pull of a handle, and the problem was, quite literally, flushed away. Except it had to go somewhere. And in a city without a modern sewer system to carry it safely out and treat it away, usually meant directly into the nearest drain, and from there, into the river. Multiply this across thousands of households adopting the new technology, and you get a horrifying acceleration of exactly the kind of contamination the old cesspit system, for all its flaws, had at least contained in one place. The flush toilet didn't eliminate the waste problem. It mobilized it, sending it directly into the same river that water companies were drawing from to supply drinking water to the rest of the city. This is not an exaggeration, and it is not a detail added for dramatic effect. Multiple water companies operating in London during this period drew their water directly from stretches of the Thames that were, by any modern standard, thick with sewage. The water that came out of a shared pump, or was delivered by a water carrier, or ran through the earliest and most rudimentary pipe systems into wealthier homes, often looked reasonably clear. It might have had a faint smell, easily explained away or ignored. But looking clear and being safe are two entirely different things, a distinction that an entire century would struggle, at enormous human cost, to fully understand. Consider the cholera outbreaks that swept through London and other major cities repeatedly across the 19th century. Today, we understand with complete clarity that cholera is a waterborne disease, caused by contaminated water carrying a specific bacterium into the digestive system. But for most of the century, this was not understood at all. The dominant medical theory of the time, which we'll explore in far more detail in a later chapter, held that disease was spread through miasma, bad air, foul smells, the invisible stench rising from rotting matter and polluted streets. Under this theory, a family drawing their drinking water from a pump situated near a leaking cesspit had no reason to suspect the water itself. The water looked fine. It was the smell in the air, the fog, the general foulness of the neighborhood that was blamed instead. This misunderstanding had devastating consequences, and it is worth walking through, slowly, exactly how catastrophic it became. During one particularly severe outbreak in a crowded London neighborhood in the mid-1850s, hundreds of people living within a small radius died within a matter of days. An outbreak so concentrated and so violent that it defied every existing explanation. Families who had done everything within their power to stay clean by the standards of the day, who had washed their doorsteps and aired out their rooms and avoided foul-smelling areas, were dying at the same rate as families living in far filthier conditions. The miasma theory simply could not explain a pattern like this. It took painstaking, door-to-door investigative work, mapping every single case, tracing every household back to its water source, interviewing survivors and grieving families alike, to finally identify the true culprit: a single water pump, drawing from a well contaminated by a nearby leaking cesspit. Once that pump's handle was removed, forcing the neighborhood to draw water elsewhere, the outbreak began to subside almost immediately. It's difficult to overstate how significant this moment was, not just for Victorian hygiene, but for the entire future of public health. It represented one of the earliest and most convincing pieces of evidence that disease could travel through water, a direct challenge to the miasma theory that had dominated medical thinking for generations. And yet, even after this evidence emerged, it took years, in some cases decades, for the broader medical and scientific community to fully abandon the old theory and accept the new one. Old ideas, once deeply embedded in a culture's understanding of the world, do not disappear the moment better evidence arrives. They linger, defended by habit and institutional pride, long after the facts have quietly moved on without them. In the meantime, ordinary families continued to draw their water from whatever source was nearest and most convenient, largely unaware of the invisible danger that might be sitting inside a perfectly clear-looking glass. Wealthier households, who could afford water piped in from companies drawing from cleaner, more distant sources, or who could afford to boil their water as a matter of habit rather than emergency, had some degree of protection, even if they didn't fully understand why. Poorer households, relying on the nearest well or pump regardless of what lay upstream or underground nearby, bore the overwhelming brunt of these outbreaks. This is a pattern that repeats throughout Victorian hygiene, again and again, in nearly every chapter of this story. Proximity to danger was rarely evenly distributed. It followed the lines of poverty almost exactly. The same crowded neighborhoods that lacked private wells, that depended on shared pumps and communal water sources, were also the neighborhoods stacked most densely with cesspits, with poor drainage, with housing built cheaply and close together to maximize the number of tenants a landlord could fit into a single building. Contaminated water didn't strike randomly. It struck where infrastructure was thinnest, and infrastructure was thinnest exactly where the poorest Victorians lived. And even for households lucky enough to access relatively cleaner water, there was still the matter of getting it home, heating it, and making it last. A single trip to a shared pump might yield 2 or 3 buckets, hauled by hand, often by children or servants, back to a household that might need that same water to last through cooking, drinking, washing dishes, laundering clothes, and, if there was any left over, bathing. It is not difficult to see, once you walk through this sequence, why bathing so often ended up at the very bottom of the list, not because Victorians didn't value cleanliness, but because water simply had too many competing demands placed upon it, and bathing was almost always the most negotiable among them. By the later decades of the century, this picture had begun to improve. Major cities invested heavily in new water infrastructure, reservoirs positioned to draw from cleaner sources, filtration systems that, while primitive by modern standards, represented a real step forward, and eventually, piped water reaching directly into individual homes rather than requiring a trip to a shared pump. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen evenly. Wealthier neighborhoods saw these improvements years, sometimes decades, before poorer ones did. But the trajectory, however slow and uneven, was unmistakably upward. What's worth carrying forward from this chapter, as we move into the next piece of this story, is a simple but essential idea. Nearly everything about how Victorians washed themselves, dressed themselves, and cared for their bodies was downstream, quite literally, of how difficult it was to access clean water in the first place. Bathing wasn't a simple daily choice, the way it is for most of us now. It was the end result of a long chain of labor, expense, and uncertainty, stretching all the way back to a well, a pump, or a river that may or may not have been carrying more than anyone realized. With that foundation now in place, we can turn to the question this entire story has been building toward from the very beginning. Given everything we now understand about how scarce, how laborious, and how uncertain water was, what did bathing itself actually look like for an ordinary Victorian family? How often did it really happen? And what did people do, in the long stretches between baths, to manage a body that water simply couldn't reach often enough? There is a number that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it, and it's worth stating plainly before we unpack what it meant in practice. For a significant portion of the Victorian working class, a full bath, meaning the entire body, submerged or thoroughly washed with water, might happen once a week. For some, it happened even less often than that. And for a portion of the poorest households, living in the most crowded and water-scarce conditions, it might happen only a handful of times a year. That number runs so completely against modern instinct that it's tempting to read judgment into it. Resist that urge. Low as it sounds, it wasn't laziness, and it wasn't indifference toward one's own body. It was the direct, unavoidable consequence of everything explored in the previous chapter, water that had to be carried, heated, and shared, in a world where every one of those steps cost time, fuel, and labor that most families simply did not have to spare on a daily basis. So what did bathing actually require, physically, in a typical Victorian household? Let's walk through it, step by step, because the process itself explains almost everything about why it happens so rarely. First, water had to be fetched from a pump, a well, or occasionally delivered by a water carrier, as we've already covered. This alone could take a significant portion of an hour, particularly if there was a queue, which there often was in densely populated neighborhoods. Multiple trips were usually required to gather enough water for even a modest bath, since a single bucket rarely provided enough for one person, let alone an entire household. Second, that water had to be heated. In a home without piped hot water, which was the overwhelming majority of homes throughout most of the century, this meant heating water over a coal or wood-burning stove, in whatever pots or kettles the household owned. Coal was not free. For a working-class family already budgeting carefully for rent, food, and the coal needed simply to cook meals and heat the home during winter, spending additional fuel purely to heat bathwater was a genuine expense, one that had to be weighed against other, more urgent needs. Third, once heated, the water had to be transferred into a bathing vessel, often a simple tin or wooden tub, sometimes little more than a large basin, positioned wherever there was space in a small, often single-room household. There was, in most working-class homes, no separate bathroom. The kitchen, or whatever single multi-purpose room the family occupied, doubled as the bathing space, meaning that bathing was not the private, closed-door ritual we imagine today, but something conducted in the same room where meals were cooked and family life unfolded, often with some effort made toward privacy through timing, screens, or simply averted eyes. And here is where the true logic of bath night reveals itself. Given the enormous effort required simply to produce a single tub of hot water, no family could justify emptying it after just one person had used it. So the water was shared, one basin, refilled with hot water perhaps once if the family could spare the fuel, used by every member of the household in sequence. Custom generally dictated that the head of the household, or sometimes the eldest, bathed first, in the cleanest, warmest water. Each subsequent family member bathed in water that was progressively cooler and progressively dirtier, until finally, the youngest children, often the ones who had gotten the filthiest over the preceding week, playing in streets thick with mud, manure, and industrial soot, bathed last, in water that had already cleaned 4, 5, sometimes 6 other bodies before them. This is, in fact, the origin of an old expression many people have heard without ever quite understanding its context, a warning against throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It sounds like an absurd image today, a strange hypothetical nobody would need to worry about. But in a Victorian household, where the youngest child bathed last in water that had grown murky, cooling, and genuinely difficult to see through, the warning carried real, literal weight. You could, in that specific and very real domestic scenario, lose track of a small child in cloudy bathwater, a detail that says more about the physical reality of Victorian bathing than almost any other single fact from the era. For the household, even a step below this, families living in the most crowded tenement housing, sometimes an entire family sharing a single room within a larger, subdivided building. Even this weekly ritual might be unreachable. There was often nowhere private enough to set up a tub, no fuel to spare even once a week, and no realistic way to haul and heat enough water for a full bath on any predictable schedule. For these households, washing meant something far more modest. A basin of cold or lukewarm water, used to wipe down the face, neck, hands, and perhaps underarms, using a cloth rather than full immersion. This kind of partial washing, sometimes called, in various contexts, a sponge bath, though the terminology varied, became the default form of daily hygiene for an enormous portion of the Victorian population, far more common than the full weekly bath that we tend to imagine as the era's baseline. This distinction matters enormously, because it means that for many Victorians, the parts of the body that were washed with any regularity were almost exclusively the visible ones: the face, the hands, the neck. The parts hidden beneath layers of clothing, which we'll explore in far more depth in the next chapter, often went untouched by water for far longer stretches, sometimes weeks at a time. This wasn't a secret or a source of particular shame within the culture itself, because it was simply the shared reality of nearly everyone around you. If your neighbor's body was in roughly the same condition as your own, there was simply no visible standard to fall short of. Cleanliness, as a lived daily practice, was judged almost entirely by what showed: clean hands, a washed face, unstained visible clothing, rather than by what lay hidden beneath. Soap itself deserves particular attention here, because its availability and cost shaped bathing habits just as significantly as water did. For much of the first half of the 19th century, soap was subject to a tax that made it a genuine luxury item for poorer households, an additional financial barrier layered directly on top of the existing difficulties of water and fuel. Even after that tax was eventually repealed, allowing soap prices to fall and production to expand, the soap available to working-class households was often a harsh, heavily alkaline product, effective at cutting through grease and grime, but rough enough on skin that frequent use could leave hands and faces chapped, cracked, and uncomfortable, particularly in cold weather. This created its own strange discouragement toward frequent washing, a physical unpleasantness that, combined with the labor and expense already involved, made daily or even frequent washing feel like an ordeal rather than a simple habit. It's worth a closer look to note something important about how Victorians themselves understood all of this, because it complicates the easy modern assumption that they simply didn't care about being clean. Cleanliness was, in fact, discussed constantly throughout Victorian society, in etiquette manuals, in domestic advice columns, in sermons, and moral instruction aimed at the working classes. Being clean was consistently framed as a sign of moral character, of self-respect, of a household run with proper order and discipline. Mothers were instructed, repeatedly and insistently, on the importance of washing their children. Domestic servants were judged, sometimes harshly, on their personal cleanliness as a reflection of their employer's household standards. The gap, then, was never one of values. It was one of means. Victorians overwhelmingly believed cleanliness mattered, arguably believed it more fervently, moralized about it more intensely than most societies before them. What they lacked was the infrastructure to consistently act on that belief across every level of society. And this gap between deeply held values and physically achievable practice created a particular kind of quiet, private anxiety for many working-class Victorians, an awareness that they were falling short of a standard they had been taught, repeatedly, to aspire to, without ever being given the practical means to reliably reach it. This anxiety expressed itself in fascinating, sometimes almost desperate ways. A thriving market emerged for perfumes, powders, and scented products, specifically marketed toward masking the reality of infrequent bathing rather than solving it. Heavily scented soaps, when a household could afford them, were valued not just for cleaning, but for the lingering fragrance they left behind, a scent that could, for a day or two, stand in for the deeper cleanliness that water alone couldn't provide often enough. Powders applied to the face and body served a similar dual purpose. They lightened and evened the skin according to prevailing beauty standards, but they also absorbed some of the oil and odor that accumulated between infrequent washes, extending the appearance of freshness for another day or two before the next wash became unavoidable. There's a particular irony worth sitting with for a second, one that connects directly back to the very first chapter of this story. The powder and perfume that Victorian society associated with elegance, with refinement, with the visible markers of a well-kept, respectable household, were often functioning as a kind of cosmetic solution to a hygiene problem that couldn't be solved through washing alone. What looked, to an observer at the time, like the height of sophisticated grooming was frequently, underneath the surface, a workaround, an ingenious, resourceful adaptation to a world that simply didn't yet have the infrastructure to make daily washing a realistic option for most people. And this brings us to a natural, almost unavoidable next question. If the body itself went weeks without full washing, hidden beneath layers of clothing that were themselves reused far more often than replaced or laundered, what was actually happening beneath the surface of Victorian fashion? What did those elaborate, beautiful garments, the corsets, the petticoats, the layered dresses and starched collars, look and feel like, worn against skin and bodies that water so rarely reached? That is where we turn next. Victorian fashion, viewed from a distance of more than a century, tends to strike modern eyes as almost impossibly elegant. Layers of fabric arranged with architectural precision, corsets shaping the body into the fashionable silhouette of whatever decade you happen to be examining, collars starched into crisp, gleaming white, petticoats rustling beneath skirts heavy enough to require real physical effort simply to walk in. It is, in every photograph and painting that survives from the period, a picture of order, control, and refinement. What those images cannot show you, what no photograph from the era was ever going to capture, is what all of that fabric actually smelled like, felt like, and carried against the skin after days, sometimes weeks, of continuous wear without proper washing. To understand why, we need to return to a fact already established in the previous chapters and push it one step further. If water was scarce and bathing itself was a weekly, sometimes less frequent ritual, then washing clothing, a task requiring even more water, more labor, and more time than bathing a single body, was rationed even more strictly. Laundry, particularly for a working-class household, was not a quick task you did whenever a garment felt slightly soiled. It was a major, physically exhausting undertaking, typically reserved for a specific day of the week, requiring hauling and heating enormous quantities of water, scrubbing fabric by hand against a washboard, wringing it out by hand, or with a simple mechanical wringer if the household was fortunate enough to own one, and then hanging everything to dry. A process that could take an entire day of hard physical labor for a single household's clothing. Given this reality, most Victorians simply did not own enough clothing to change garments daily, and even if they had, laundering everything that frequently would have been physically impossible within the constraints of their weekly schedule. Instead, a system of layering developed, one that, once you understand its internal logic, reveals a surprisingly sophisticated adaptation to the hygiene challenges of the era. The layer worn closest to the skin, typically a simple undergarment made of linen or cotton, was, in theory, the piece most frequently changed and washed, precisely because it was the layer directly absorbing sweat, oils, and the general accumulation of an unwashed body. The outer garments, the dresses, coats, and trousers that were visible to the world, were washed far less frequently, sometimes only a handful of times per year, because their fabric was more delicate, more expensive, more difficult to launder without damage, and because, crucially, they weren't in direct contact with skin. This layering system meant that, in theory, the innermost garment could be changed relatively often even when the outer, visible clothing remained unwashed for extended stretches. In practice, however, this system broke down constantly under the weight of real financial and logistical constraints. Owning enough undergarments to rotate and wash them frequently required a wardrobe most working-class households simply could not afford. A single undergarment might be worn for several days in a row before being washed, absorbing sweat and body oils the entire time, particularly during the summer months or during physical labor. And because outer garments were worn over the top of this already soiled inner layer day after day, they too gradually absorbed odor and residue, regardless of how infrequently they were directly touching skin. Now layer onto this the corset, perhaps the single garment most associated with Victorian fashion in the modern imagination, and one that deserves particular attention when discussing hygiene specifically. A corset was typically worn directly against, or very near, the skin for the majority of a woman's waking hours, providing the structural foundation beneath nearly every fashionable outer garment of the era. It was tightly laced, form-fitting, and made of layers of fabric reinforced with boning, meaning it was neither easy nor quick to remove, and certainly not something laundered with any regularity given the complexity of its construction. A corset worn daily, sweated into, pressed tightly against skin for hours at a stretch, and rarely, if ever fully washed, became, over time, an object that held an enormous amount of accumulated odor and residue, something contemporary accounts occasionally allude to, even if Victorian etiquette generally discouraged frank discussion of such unglamorous physical realities. This layered, rarely washed system had consequences that went well beyond simple odor. And this is where the story takes a genuinely uncomfortable turn, one that connects hygiene directly to physical suffering in a way that modern readers often find startling. Lice and other parasitic insects were, quite simply, a routine part of life for an enormous portion of the Victorian population, cutting across class lines far more than most people assume. While the wealthy, with their access to frequent laundering, multiple changes of clothing, and dedicated servants managing their wardrobes, could reduce their risk considerably, they were not entirely immune, particularly in crowded social settings or when interacting with domestic staff. For the working class, however, lice were often simply an accepted, ongoing presence, something managed rather than eliminated, treated with various folk remedies and, later in the century, increasingly effective commercial products, but rarely fully eradicated in households where clean clothing and regular bathing remained difficult to maintain. Chemists and market stalls throughout Victorian cities did a steady trade in remedies aimed at exactly this problem. Fine-toothed combs specifically designed to catch lice and their eggs, various oils and powders claimed to repel or kill them, and later, chemical treatments developed as understanding of parasites improved. The sheer volume and variety of these products speaks to just how widespread the problem genuinely was. A remedy doesn't achieve that kind of commercial staying power addressing a rare or occasional issue. This was a persistent, everyday reality for a huge swath of the population, discussed with the same practical, unembarrassed matter-of-factness that we might apply today to something like dandruff or seasonal allergies, an ongoing nuisance to be managed rather than a source of particular shame, because it was so nearly universal. There is also the matter of the smell itself, which deserves honest acknowledgement rather than delicate avoidance, because it shaped Victorian social life in ways that are difficult for modern readers to fully appreciate. Crowded indoor spaces, churches, theaters, public transport, workplaces, packed with people wearing rarely washed layered clothing, many of whom bathed only weekly at best, must have carried an odor that would be almost overwhelming by contemporary standards. Victorians themselves were certainly aware of this reality, even if their explanations for it, rooted in the miasma theory covered in an earlier chapter, misunderstood its actual danger. Elaborate use of perfume, scented sachets tucked into clothing and drawers, and pomanders carried specifically to mask ambient odor in public spaces were not simply fashionable accessories. They were practical tools, deployed constantly, in direct response to a lived olfactory reality that everyone experienced and almost no one discussed openly in polite company. Class, predictably, shaped every dimension of this experience unevenly. Wealthy households could afford far larger wardrobes, allowing for genuine rotation between garments and giving laundered clothing time to properly dry and air out between wears. They employed servants specifically tasked with the enormous labor of laundering, a burden that, for a working-class household, had to be absorbed on top of an already exhausting schedule of paid labor, cooking, and childcare. Wealthy women's corsets and undergarments could be replaced or laundered far more frequently, and their outer garments, made from finer, more expensive fabric, were often specifically constructed to be more resistant to absorbing odor in the first place. This meant that the visible cleanliness so carefully performed by wealthy Victorians was, to a genuinely meaningful degree, actually backed by real hygienic advantage, not simply better acting, but better access to the resources required to make the performance closer to reality. For the working class, by contrast, the gap between the performance of respectability, the carefully maintained starched collar, the neatly pressed visible outer layer, and the physical reality underneath remained wide and largely unbridgeable through effort alone. Not a failure of will or character, in other words, but the direct, compounding result of everything explored so far in this story: scarce water, expensive fuel, limited wardrobes, and a laundering process so physically demanding that it could only realistically happen once a week at best, layered onto a body that itself was only fully washed on roughly the same limited schedule. What emerges from all of this is a picture considerably more complex and considerably more sympathetic than the simple assumption that Victorians were merely dirtier than we are today by choice or ignorance. They were operating within a system stacked with genuine, physical constraints at nearly every level. Constraints on water, on fuel, on time, on wardrobe, on laundering capacity, and they built, within those constraints, an entire elaborate culture of visible presentation specifically designed to project the cleanliness and respectability that the underlying physical reality simply couldn't consistently deliver. And this brings the story to a very specific, very personal piece of the human body, one that reveals, perhaps more vividly than any other single detail we've covered so far, just how different Victorian hygiene truly was from our own. Because if bathing was weekly and clothing was reused for days or weeks at a stretch, what, exactly, was happening inside people's mouths? What did Victorian teeth look like, and what were people using day to day to try to take care of them? There is a particular kind of quiet dread that settles over most people the first time they understand what Victorian dental health actually looked like, and it's worth beginning this chapter by naming that dread directly, rather than easing into it gradually. Losing most, or even all, of your natural teeth by your 30s was not an unusual misfortune reserved for the poorest or most neglected members of Victorian society. It was, across a remarkably wide swath of the population, simply an expected, ordinary part of aging, so common that a full set of false teeth was, for a significant portion of the century, considered a genuinely fashionable and desirable milestone rather than a source of particular embarrassment. To understand how this became the norm, we need to walk carefully through what Victorian dental hygiene involved, because the picture is considerably more layered and considerably more revealing than simply assuming nobody brushed their teeth. Toothbrushes themselves did exist throughout the Victorian era, evolving steadily in design and availability as the century progressed. Early versions typically used handles carved from bone or wood, fitted with bristles made from animal hair, commonly hog bristle, a material that, while functional, was far coarser and less hygienic than anything used in a modern toothbrush, and that could itself harbor bacteria between uses given the complete absence of any sterilization process. Ownership of a toothbrush expanded considerably over the course of the century, moving from a luxury largely confined to wealthier households in the earlier decades towards something closer to a common household item by the century's later years as manufacturing improved and prices fell. But owning a toothbrush and understanding how to use it effectively, in service of a goal we now take for granted, were two very different things. The scientific understanding that would eventually explain exactly how tooth decay worked, the role of bacteria, plaque, and acid in breaking down enamel, was still developing throughout much of the century, deeply intertwined with the same broader revolution in germ theory that we'll explore in far more detail in a later chapter. For most of the Victorian era, tooth care was guided not by a precise understanding of bacterial decay, but by a general, somewhat vaguer sense that cleaning the teeth was good practice, paired with tooth powders and pastes whose actual effectiveness varied wildly. These early tooth powders deserve particular attention, because their ingredients range from helpful to actively harmful, often within the very same product. Many contain chalk or similarly mild abrasive substances, reasonably effective at removing surface residue without causing significant damage. Others, marketed with considerable confidence and often quite popular, contain far harsher abrasives, occasionally including substances as damaging as finely ground charcoal or even mildly acidic compounds, which could gradually wear away tooth enamel with regular use, ultimately making teeth more vulnerable to the very decay the powder claimed to prevent. Some commercial tooth powders, particularly in the earlier decades of the century, contained ingredients that would raise serious alarm by any modern safety standard, sold and used with genuine confidence in their effectiveness, precisely because the science required to properly evaluate their safety simply did not yet exist. Layered on top of an inconsistent and sometimes counterproductive approach to daily tooth cleaning was a diet that, for much of the Victorian population, actively worked against dental health. Sugar consumption rose dramatically over the course of the 19th century, driven by falling prices, expanding colonial sugar production, and the growing popularity of sweetened tea, a beverage that had, by the Victorian era, become an absolutely central fixture of daily life across virtually every social class. Sweetened tea, consumed multiple times a day by an enormous portion of the population, delivered a steady, near-constant supply of sugar directly into contact with the teeth, hour after hour, day after day, throughout an entire lifetime, precisely the kind of sustained exposure that modern dentistry recognizes as devastating for long-term dental health, but which Victorians had no meaningful way to understand or guard against. Combine inconsistent, sometimes actively harmful cleaning methods with a diet steadily increasing in sugar, and layer this onto a medical understanding of dental care that remained genuinely primitive by modern standards, and the result was, almost inevitably, widespread and severe tooth decay across nearly every level of Victorian society. Dental pain was an extremely common complaint, treated, for much of the century, through methods that ranged from mildly effective to frightening. Extraction, simply pulling a decayed or painful tooth, remained, throughout most of the era, the single most common response to serious dental problems, performed not necessarily by trained dentists in the modern sense, but frequently by barbers, general practitioners, or itinerant tooth pullers who traveled between towns offering their services at markets and fairs, often with minimal anesthesia and considerable pain involved in the process. This is where the story arrives at a detail that consistently surprises modern audiences: the remarkable popularity and genuine social desirability of false teeth throughout Victorian society. Given how common severe tooth loss was by early or middle adulthood, a full or partial set of false teeth was not viewed with the stigma we might expect today. Instead, it was often considered a practical, sensible, and even somewhat fashionable solution, a way to restore a presentable smile and functional bite after the near-inevitable losses of natural teeth. Wealthier Victorians could afford false teeth crafted from genuinely high-quality materials, including, in various periods throughout the century, ivory, porcelain, or in earlier decades, teeth sourced from cadavers or purchased from the poor, who sold their own healthy teeth for needed income, a practice that sounds almost unbelievable to modern ears, but was a documented, if uncomfortable, feature of the era's dental economy. For those who couldn't afford quality false teeth, the alternative was often simply living with the gaps, the pain, and the compromised ability to chew that came with significant tooth loss, adjusting diet and daily life around a mouth that had, by relatively young adulthood, already lost a substantial portion of its original function. This reality, though rarely discussed openly given Victorian social conventions around frank physical discussion, would have shaped daily life in ways we rarely consider when picturing the era, affecting speech, appetite, the simple pleasure of eating, and, inevitably, self-confidence and social presentation, in a culture that placed such enormous weight on outward appearance. Breath, unsurprisingly, followed the same trajectory as the rest of Victorian hygiene already explored in this story, a gap between social expectation and physical reality, bridged as best as possible through masking rather than genuine solution. Just as perfume and powder were deployed to manage body odor between infrequent baths, various mouth rinses, chewed herbs, and scented lozenges were used throughout the era specifically to combat the breath consequences of poor dental health, decaying teeth, and a diet steadily saturating itself with sugar. Cloves, in particular, saw widespread use both for their pleasant scent and for a mild numbing effect on dental pain, chewed directly or used in various tooth powder formulations, a folk remedy that, interestingly, had at least some genuine basis in the numbing properties of the clove plant itself, even if Victorians understood this more through inherited tradition than precise scientific explanation. It's worth spelling out to notice something that connects this chapter directly back to the broader pattern running through the entire story so far. Just as with bathing and clothing, the wealthy experienced a different, materially better version of this same fundamental problem. They could afford more effective tooth powders, higher quality false teeth when extraction became necessary, and dentists with more careful, more developed technique, even within the genuine limitations of the era's overall medical knowledge. The poor, by contrast, faced the same underlying dental crisis with far fewer resources to manage it, often enduring pain for far longer before extraction became unavoidable and settling, when they could afford false teeth at all, for far lower quality alternatives. And yet, remarkably, dental care did genuinely improve as the century progressed, tracking closely alongside the broader scientific developments explored throughout this story. As the final decades of the Victorian era approached, alongside the emerging understanding of germ theory that would eventually transform nearly every aspect of hygiene and medicine, dentistry itself began to professionalize in earnest, moving away from itinerant tooth pullers and toward trained practitioners, developing more effective tools, better anesthesia options, and a steadily improving scientific understanding of exactly why teeth decayed in the first place, and what might actually be done to prevent it, rather than simply treat it after the damage had already been done. This slow, uneven improvement, starting from a place of genuine hardship and gradually, unevenly moving towards something closer to modern practice, is a pattern we'll see repeated across nearly every dimension of Victorian hygiene as this story continues. And it sets up perfectly the next, perhaps most uncomfortable chapter in this entire journey. Because if teeth reveal so much about the gap between appearance and reality in Victorian hygiene, there is one topic that reveals it even more starkly, a topic most period dramas skip entirely, but one that sat, quite literally, beneath every single Victorian household, whether wealthy or poor. What happened, exactly, to human waste in a world without modern plumbing? Where did it go, who dealt with it, and how close, exactly, did it sit to the water people were drinking and the food people were eating? That is where we turn next. Every era has the parts of its history that get quietly left out of the paintings, and Victorian sanitation might be the single largest such omission of the entire 19th century. It is almost never shown in period dramas, rarely lingered on in popular retellings of the era, and yet it sat, in the most literal sense possible, beneath nearly every home, every street, and every neighborhood across Victorian Britain, an enormous, slow-building crisis that took decades to fully understand and even longer to properly solve. Let's begin with the most basic question, the one that modern life has made so automatic we rarely think to ask it at all. Where did human waste go, in a world before flush toilets were widely available? For the majority of the Victorian era, especially its earlier decades, the answer was the cesspit, a pit, typically dug beneath or near a house, into which human waste was deposited, either directly through a simple privy positioned above it, or via chamber pots that were used indoors, particularly at night or by those unable or unwilling to venture outside to a shared privy, and then emptied into the pit afterward. These cesspits were, by design, meant to be periodically emptied by workers known as night soil men, who would, under cover of darkness given the deeply unpleasant nature of the task, dig out the accumulated waste and haul it away, often to be sold as fertilizer to farms surrounding the city, an early, functional recycling system that, in theory, closed the loop reasonably well. In theory. In practice, the system buckled catastrophically under the sheer weight of Victorian urban population growth. Cities like London expanded so rapidly, and so much faster than any planned infrastructure could accommodate, that cesspits meant to serve a handful of households were often shared, informally and unofficially, by dozens of families crammed into subdivided housing. Night soil men, however diligently they worked, simply could not keep pace with the volume being produced by a population that had grown many times over within the span of a single generation. Cesspits overflowed. They leaked into surrounding soil. And in a grim, entirely predictable pattern given everything already covered in this story, they leaked, with alarming frequency, directly into the wells and shallow water sources that many of the same households depended on for their drinking water. This is worth saying plainly directly, because it is perhaps the single most important fact connecting everything covered so far in this story into one coherent, devastating picture. The same crowded neighborhoods that lacked private wells, that depended on shared water pumps, were, almost without exception, the same neighborhoods where cesspits sat closest to those water sources, poorly maintained and constantly at risk of overflow. Poverty concentrated both the danger and the exposure to that danger in the very same physical space, creating conditions for exactly the kind of catastrophic outbreaks explored in an earlier chapter, outbreaks that struck poorer neighborhoods with disproportionate, devastating force, not through any particular carelessness on the part of the people living there, but through the simple, brutal geometry of contaminated waste sitting too close to drinking water, in housing crammed too densely, together to allow for any safer alternative. Then came the flush toilet. And here the story takes a turn that genuinely surprises most people encountering it for the first time, because it runs directly against our modern instinct that new technology automatically represents unambiguous improvement. The flush toilet began appearing in wealthier Victorian homes in growing numbers over the middle decades of the century, offering what seemed, on its face, like an obvious upgrade over the chamber pot and cesspit system. No more waste accumulating in a pit beneath the house. No more chamber pots requiring emptying by hand. A single pull of a handle, and the waste simply vanished from sight and smell, flushed away by a rush of water into whatever drainage existed beneath the street. But this is precisely where the crisis actually deepened rather than resolved, for a reason already touched on in an earlier chapter, but worth returning to here in full detail. That flushed waste had to go somewhere, and in a city that had not yet built anything resembling a proper, enclosed sewer system designed to carry waste safely away and treat it, somewhere, usually meant the nearest existing drain. Drains originally designed and built centuries earlier to carry away rainwater runoff, never engineered to handle a sudden, dramatic increase in raw sewage. These drains fed, as they always had, directly into the city's rivers. The result, playing out across London specifically through the middle decades of the century, was a river receiving an ever-increasing volume of raw human waste, flushed in by a technology adopted specifically because it seemed cleaner and more modern than what came before. The irony here is almost impossible to overstate. A genuine improvement in individual household hygiene, adopted with entirely good intentions by families who could afford it, collectively produced a public health catastrophe of staggering scale, because it mobilized waste that had previously, however imperfectly, remained relatively contained, sending it instead directly into the same river that water companies were drawing from to supply drinking water across the city. This mounting crisis reached its most vivid, most infamous peak during an extraordinarily hot summer in the late 1850s, when the volume of sewage accumulated in the Thames, combined with unusually high temperatures, produced an odor so overwhelming, so inescapable, that it disrupted the functioning of government itself. Officials working in buildings directly along the riverbank found the smell so severe that curtains were soaked in chemicals in a desperate attempt to mask it, and serious discussion arose about relocating government proceedings entirely away from a river that had become, quite literally, unbearable to be near. This event, remembered by later generations as a moment of civic reckoning, finally provided the political momentum needed to fund and construct what had been proposed and debated, but consistently delayed, for years, a genuinely modern, comprehensive sewer system designed to carry waste safely out of the city entirely, rather than simply dumping it into the same river the city depended on for water. The engineering achievement that followed deserves genuine recognition, even within a story otherwise focused on hardship and difficulty, because it represents one of the first moments where Victorian society applied real, systematic, large-scale infrastructure investment specifically towards solving a hygiene crisis, rather than simply managing its symptoms through individual household adaptation. Massive underground sewer networks were constructed beneath London over the following years, engineered to intercept waste before it reached the river and carry it instead to treatment and discharge points far downstream, away from the sources supplying the city's drinking water. This was slow, expensive, and difficult engineering work, but it represented a fundamental shift in approach, an acknowledgement, finally backed by real investment, that individual households alone could never solve a problem this large, and that only coordinated, citywide infrastructure could address a crisis of this scale. But, and this is a pattern that should feel familiar by now, given everything covered throughout this story, this transformation arrived unevenly, reaching wealthier neighborhoods and central areas of major cities considerably faster than poorer, more peripheral ones. Working-class neighborhoods, particularly those further from the city center or in smaller industrial towns rapidly growing around new factories, often continued relying on cesspits, shared privies, and inadequate drainage for years, sometimes decades, after wealthier central districts had already gained access to properly engineered sewers. The same pattern of inequality that shaped water access, bathing habits, clothing, and dental care repeated itself here as well, with sanitation infrastructure following the money and the political influence, arriving last in exactly the neighborhoods that needed it most urgently. For ordinary households still relying on chamber pots throughout much of the century, daily life involved a level of direct, unavoidable proximity to human waste that is genuinely difficult for modern readers to fully picture. Chamber pots were kept, quite commonly, in bedrooms, used overnight rather than requiring a trip outside to a shared privy in the dark and cold, and emptied each morning, a task that fell, in most households, to women and children, or to servants in wealthier homes, carried out to the nearest privy, cesspit, or, in a practice that persisted longer than most people realized despite regulations attempting to prevent it, sometimes simply emptied directly into the street or nearest available drain. Particularly in the most crowded, poorly regulated neighborhoods where enforcement was weakest and alternatives were fewest. This proximity, waste stored indoors overnight, carried out by hand each morning, sometimes disposed of just outside a home's front door, helps explain something explored in earlier chapters that might otherwise seem strange. The Victorian obsession with scent, with perfume, with masking odor through any means available. Call it a practical response, not vanity or fashion, to living in close proximity to smells that, by modern standards, would be considered entirely unacceptable in daily domestic life, but which Victorians had no choice but to adapt to, manage, and, wherever possible, disguise. What emerges from this chapter, when placed alongside everything explored so far, is perhaps the clearest possible illustration of the entire story's central theme. Victorian hygiene wasn't a simple, static condition, a single fixed level of cleanliness maintained uniformly across the era. It was a moving, evolving struggle, shaped by genuine effort, genuine investment, and genuine engineering achievement, but constantly outpaced by explosive population growth, chronically underfunded in the neighborhoods that needed it most, and, for most of the century, operating without any real scientific understanding of exactly why any of it mattered so urgently in the first place. Because here is the piece of the puzzle we have circled around throughout this entire story without yet addressing directly. Victorians washed what they could, dressed as respectably as they could manage, tried, in every way available to them, to project cleanliness and order onto lives that were, in physical reality, considerably messier than they appeared. But they did all of this while operating under a fundamentally mistaken theory of what actually caused disease in the first place, a theory that shaped public health policy, individual behavior, and medical practice for the majority of the century, and that, however sincerely believed, sent an entire society chasing the wrong enemy for decades. What was that theory? Where did it come from? And how, eventually, did it finally collapse under the weight of evidence too overwhelming to ignore? That is where this story turns next. For most of the 19th century, if you had asked a Victorian doctor what caused disease, the answer would not have involved germs, bacteria, or viruses at all. It would have involved smell. The theory was called miasma, and it held, with real confidence and considerable medical authority behind it. That disease spread through foul air rising from decaying matter, rotting waste, stagnant water, overcrowded and poorly ventilated housing, graveyards, swamps. Anywhere organic material was breaking down and releasing what people at the time called bad air. Breathe enough of it in, the theory went, and sickness would follow. It sounds almost quaint now, easy to dismiss as an obviously wrong idea that a little common sense should have caught. What kept miasma theory alive so long wasn't stupidity. It was fit. The theory matched the evidence people could see with their own eyes, and it fit that evidence better than anything else available at the time. Think about what 19th century observers had to work with. Disease clustered in poor, overcrowded neighborhoods. Those same neighborhoods stank, from open sewers, crowded housing, unwashed bodies, and rotting refuse in the streets. Disease got worse in summer, when heat accelerated decay and made the smell worse. Disease seemed to travel with the wind, drifting from one area to another the way an odor might. Every one of those observations was real. Miasma theory explained all of them cleanly, and it explained them in a way that matched what people could directly perceive with their own senses. You couldn't see a bacterium in 1840. You could absolutely smell a slum. So the theory took hold, and it shaped an entire century of public health policy built on a foundation that was, in the end, wrong. Consider what that actually meant in practice. If bad smells caused disease, then the logical response to an outbreak was to eliminate the smell. Better ventilation, cleaner streets, removal of waste from populated areas, wider roads to let air circulate more freely. A great deal of this work was, frankly, good and useful, even though it was aimed at the wrong target. Clearing waste out of crowded streets reduced contact with contaminated material, even if nobody understood exactly why that mattered. Improved ventilation genuinely did reduce the spread of some airborne illnesses, even while doing nothing whatsoever for the waterborne ones that were devastating cities like London. Miasma theory got some things right by accident, which is precisely what made it so difficult to dislodge. When your wrong theory occasionally produces the correct outcome, you don't go looking for a replacement. But miasma theory also produced some dangerous responses, and this is where its cost becomes clearest. Recall the cholera outbreak explored 2 chapters ago, the one eventually traced to a single contaminated water pump. When that outbreak first struck, the dominant medical response wasn't to investigate the water at all. It was to fumigate the air, burn substances believed to purify foul atmosphere, and encourage residents to avoid areas with the worst smells, none of which addressed the actual danger sitting in a shared well a short walk from where people lived. Families who dutifully avoided foul-smelling streets while continuing to drink from a contaminated pump had no way of knowing they were doing everything wrong. The theory they trusted was actively pointing them away from the real threat. This is worth pausing on, because it reveals something important about how scientific progress actually works, as opposed to how we tend to imagine it working from a comfortable distance. We like to picture a clean, dramatic moment, a wrong idea, a breakthrough discovery, and an immediate, grateful adoption of the truth. Real scientific change rarely moves that way. It moves slowly, unevenly, and with enormous institutional resistance, because an established theory has usually built up decades of infrastructure, careers, published research, and public policy around it. Overturning it means admitting that a great deal of prior work, prior confidence, and prior authority was misdirected. That's a difficult thing for any institution to do quickly, even when the evidence starts pointing clearly in a new direction. And the evidence, as it turned out, had already started arriving well before most of the medical establishment was ready to accept it. The doctor who traced that London cholera outbreak back to a single pump wasn't working from germ theory in any modern sense. He didn't know what a bacterium was, not in the way we understand the term today. What he had instead was patience and a method. He went door to door, mapped every case of illness onto a physical map of the neighborhood, and noticed something that miasma theory couldn't explain. The households closest to the worst-smelling parts of the neighborhood weren't necessarily the ones getting sick. The households drawing water from one specific pump were. A local brewery a short distance away, whose workers drank beer rather than water and happened to sit in one of the smelliest parts of the district, had almost no cases of illness at all, despite being surrounded by exactly the foul air miasma theory blamed for disease. That single, stubborn anomaly. Workers in the smelliest building in the neighborhood staying almost entirely healthy simply because they weren't drinking the local water did more to undermine miasma theory than any amount of theoretical argument could have. It was concrete, it was documented, and it pointed at a specific, physical, waterborne cause rather than a vague atmospheric one. And yet, even armed with this evidence, it took years for the wider medical community to genuinely shift its thinking. The initial response from many established physicians was skepticism, sometimes outright dismissal. Miasma theory had the weight of tradition and institutional authority behind it. A single detailed case study, however compelling, wasn't enough on its own to overturn a framework that had shaped medicine for generations. Real change required more evidence, arriving from multiple directions at once, over a longer stretch of time than any single dramatic breakthrough could provide. Researchers on the continent, working independently through the middle decades of the century, began developing what would eventually become known as germ theory, the idea that specific, identifiable microorganisms, invisible to the naked eye but observable under increasingly powerful microscopes, were the actual cause of specific diseases. This work built slowly, through careful laboratory experimentation, disproving competing explanations one at a time, demonstrating again and again that particular organisms could be isolated, cultured, and shown to cause particular illnesses when introduced into a healthy subject. It's worth a closer look to notice how different this process was from the popular, simplified version of scientific discovery we tend to imagine, the single genius having a sudden flash of insight that changes everything overnight. What happened was slower, more collaborative, and messier. Multiple researchers working on related problems, some building directly on others' findings, some independently arriving at similar conclusions, some initially rejected or ignored before their work was later recognized as foundational. Progress moved in fits and starts, with false leads, professional rivalries, and genuine scientific disagreement slowing things down at every stage. Meanwhile, in the world explored throughout this story so far, ordinary Victorian life continued operating largely under the old framework. Public health policy through most of the middle decades of the century remained heavily influenced by miasma thinking, even as evidence against it accumulated. Major sanitary reforms, including much of the sewer construction discussed in the previous chapter, were often justified publicly using miasma logic, framed as necessary to eliminate dangerous smells, even when the underlying benefit, removing contaminated waste from proximity to drinking water, had far more to do with the physical, waterborne danger that miasma theory had never correctly identified. This created a strange situation that persisted for years, enormously beneficial public health infrastructure being built and justified using an incorrect underlying theory. The sewers that finally carried London's waste safely away from its drinking water supply were, in a real sense, right for the wrong reasons, at least in how officials publicly explained their necessity. The engineers and reformers pushing for these projects weren't wrong that something needed to change. They were often wrong about precisely why it needed to change, and that gap between correct action and incorrect reasoning is one of the more genuinely fascinating threads running through this entire period of medical history. For ordinary families, none of this theoretical debate translated into much practical difference in daily life for a long time. Whether disease was believed to spread through bad air or contaminated water, the actual behaviors available to most working-class households, given everything covered throughout this story about scarce water, expensive fuel, and limited housing options, remained largely the same. You couldn't simply choose to live somewhere with better ventilation or move away from a contaminated water source if you couldn't afford the rent anywhere else. Understanding the true cause of disease, when that understanding finally did arrive and spread, mattered enormously for future prevention and treatment, but it didn't, on its own, hand poor families the resources needed to act differently in the moment. What changed everything, eventually, was the slow accumulation of undeniable laboratory evidence, paired with a handful of dramatic, publicly visible demonstrations that made germ theory impossible to keep dismissing. A researcher showing that a specific bacterium, introduced deliberately, could reliably produce a specific disease again and again, under controlled conditions, was a different order of evidence than a single well-documented case study, however compelling. It was reproducible. It could be checked, challenged, and repeated by other scientists in other laboratories, and it kept holding up. By the final decades of the Victorian era, this accumulated weight of evidence had finally begun tipping medical consensus decisively away from miasma and toward the germ-based understanding of disease that we now take for granted. This shift didn't just change abstract medical theory. It changed practical, everyday behavior in ways that touched nearly every subject already covered in this story. How surgeons approached cleanliness during operations, how households were advised to handle contaminated water, how illness was diagnosed and treated, and eventually, how an entire industry built around soap, sanitation, and personal hygiene would reshape itself around genuine scientific understanding rather than inherited assumption. That transformation, the moment personal hygiene stopped being primarily about appearance and started becoming genuinely, scientifically grounded in an understanding of what actually made people sick, deserves its own careful telling. But before we get there, there's a piece of this story still sitting unexplored, the commercial side of cleanliness. Because even while miasma theory still dominated medical thinking, an entirely different force was already reshaping how Victorians thought about washing themselves. Not medicine, not science, advertising. That's where we turn next. At the beginning of the 19th century, soap was, for most people, a luxury. By the century's end, it had become one of the most heavily advertised, most widely available household products in the entire British economy, and one of the most successful examples of a company shaping public behavior not through scientific persuasion, but through sheer marketing force. The story of how that happened tells you almost as much about Victorian hygiene as anything covered so far in this series, because it reveals just how much of cleanliness was, in the end, manufactured by people trying to sell it. Let's start with why soap was so expensive in the first place, because the reason isn't simply about production cost or scarce ingredients. For much of the early 19th century, soap was subject to a direct government tax, a levy applied specifically to its manufacture that pushed the price of finished soap well beyond what many working-class households could comfortably afford. This tax had been in place for well over a century by the time Queen Victoria came to the throne, originally introduced as a straightforward revenue measure with little consideration given to its effect on public hygiene. Since at the time it was first imposed, hygiene wasn't yet understood as a matter of urgent public health concern the way it would come to be by the century's later decades. The consequence, though, was significant. Soap that could have been produced and sold relatively cheaply carried a price tag that placed it firmly in luxury territory for a large portion of the population, precisely the population, as we've already covered, that was struggling hardest with the scarce water and expensive fuel needed to bathe in the first place. Layering an expensive, taxed soap on top of an already difficult bathing process made real, thorough washing even less achievable for working-class families, compounding a hygiene gap that was already wide before the tax was even factored in. Pressure to repeal this tax built steadily over the middle decades of the century, driven by a growing chorus of public health reformers who had begun, even without full scientific understanding of germ theory, to connect cleanliness with reduced illness in overcrowded urban populations. When the tax was finally repealed in the middle of the century, the effect on the soap market was immediate and dramatic. Prices fell, production expanded, and, crucially, an opening emerged for manufacturers to compete for a much larger customer base than had ever been commercially accessible before. This is where the story shifts from taxation policy into something that feels, remarkably, quite modern: brand building. A handful of soap manufacturers, recognizing the newly available mass market created by falling prices, began investing heavily in something that hadn't previously been a significant part of how soap was sold: large-scale, consistent, image-driven advertising. Rather than simply selling soap as a functional cleaning product, these companies began marketing it as something closer to a lifestyle purchase, tied explicitly to respectability, social status, morality, and even national identity. This period saw some of the earliest and most sophisticated branded advertising campaigns in British commercial history, built specifically around soap. Manufacturers commissioned elaborate illustrated advertisements, distributed collectible trading cards featuring their products, sponsored public events, and, in some cases, associated their brands with popular contemporary artwork and imagery, borrowing established cultural prestige to lend their product an air of sophistication it might not have earned through pure functionality alone. The messaging leaned heavily into exactly the anxieties already explored throughout this story. The gap between wanting to appear clean and respectable and the genuine difficulty of achieving that cleanliness given real physical constraints on water, time, and money. Advertising copy from this period, when you read it, is startlingly direct about tying soap use to moral and social worth in a way that would feel almost aggressive by modern advertising standards. Cleanliness wasn't marketed simply as pleasant or practical. It was marketed as a moral obligation, a marker of civilization itself, something closely bound up with contemporary Victorian ideas about empire, progress, and the supposed superiority of British domestic order compared to other cultures around the world. This messaging tapped directly into anxieties that were already deeply embedded in Victorian culture, the same anxieties explored in earlier chapters around class, respectability, and the desperate desire to visibly signal one's place in a rigidly stratified society. What makes this interesting from a hygiene history perspective, rather than simply an advertising history one, is how this commercial pressure actually did produce real, measurable improvements in public health, even though the motivation behind it was profit rather than science. As soap became cheaper and more heavily marketed, and as public health messaging increasingly reinforced the connection between washing and staying healthy, even without a precise scientific understanding of exactly why, actual soap consumption across British households rose substantially over the final decades of the century. More households could afford more soap, more often, and cultural pressure, driven significantly by advertising, pushed frequency of washing upward even among families who might not have prioritized it as heavily before. This created a genuinely interesting convergence between commerce and public health, two forces that don't always align neatly. Soap manufacturers had every financial incentive to convince the public that frequent washing was essential, valuable, and worth spending money on, and that message happened to align closely with what public health reformers, increasingly influenced by emerging germ theory in the later decades of the century, were also trying to communicate. The result was a period where advertising and genuine medical advice were, for once, pushing largely in the same direction, even if they arrived at that alignment for very different reasons. Soap itself also improved in quality over this period, moving away from some of the harsher, more heavily alkaline formulations that had made frequent washing physically uncomfortable in earlier decades. New manufacturing processes allowed for milder, more consistently produced bars, and increasing competition between rival manufacturers pushed companies to differentiate themselves not just through advertising, but through genuine product quality, offering scented varieties, gentler formulations marketed specifically for delicate skin, and specialized products aimed at particular uses, from laundry to bathing to shaving. This expanding market also began to reflect and reinforce the class divisions already running throughout this entire story. Premium soap brands, marketed with the most elaborate and prestige-driven advertising, remained priced well beyond what working-class households would spend regularly, positioned instead toward the growing Victorian middle class and wealthy households eager to display their refinement through the specific, branded products they used. Cheaper, more basic soap became increasingly accessible to working-class families, narrowing the affordability gap that had existed under the earlier tax regime, but a real gap in product quality, fragrance, and brand prestige persisted, mapping neatly onto the same class distinctions already explored in earlier chapters around clothing, bathing frequency, and dental care. There's a particular irony worth sitting with for a second, one that connects directly back to the very first chapter of this entire story. Soap advertising during this period frequently used imagery of childhood innocence and domestic purity, cherubic children being bathed by loving mothers, gleaming white household interiors, families presented as the picture of order and respectability, entirely built around the product being sold. This imagery helped cement cleanliness even more firmly as a marker of moral and social virtue in the Victorian imagination, reinforcing exactly the performance-focused culture explored throughout this entire story, where looking clean and being genuinely, thoroughly clean were two related but distinctly separate achievements. And yet, for all the marketing hyperbole and moral messaging wrapped around it, The soap industry's expansion during this period represents one of the genuine, unambiguous bright spots in this whole story. Real hygiene, not just its appearance, did measurably improve as soap became cheaper, gentler, and more culturally normalized as an everyday necessity rather than an occasional luxury. Skin conditions related to harsh, infrequent washing likely declined. The spread of certain contagious illnesses, particularly those transmitted through direct contact and poor hand hygiene, likely slowed, even before anyone fully understood the precise mechanism behind why washing hands mattered so much. This chapter's story, commerce accidentally aligning with public health, is worth carrying forward as we move into some of the most genuinely difficult material in this entire series. Because the next chapter turns to a subject that sits at the very center of everything explored so far. What all of this, the scarce water, the infrequent bathing, the contaminated wells, the overflowing cesspits, actually meant for the most vulnerable members of Victorian society. Not adults, who could at least understand and adapt to the risks around them as best they could. Children, specifically infants, born into a world where hygiene, sanitation, and disease prevention were still catching up to the scale of the crisis surrounding them, and where the consequences of that gap were measured devastatingly in mortality statistics that remain difficult to read even from a distance of more than a century. That is where we turn next. This chapter carries a weight the others haven't, and it's worth acknowledging that plainly before beginning. Everything explored so far in this story, the scarce water, the infrequent bathing, the contaminated wells, the overflowing cesspits, the wrong theory of disease guiding public health policy for most of a century, converges in this chapter on the group least equipped to survive its consequences: Victorian infants and young children. The numbers alone tell part of the story, and they are genuinely difficult to sit with. Across much of the 19th century, particularly in its earlier and middle decades, infant mortality in Britain's growing industrial cities reached levels that would be considered an unthinkable catastrophe by modern standards. In the most crowded, poorest urban neighborhoods, it was not unusual for a substantial portion of children to die before reaching their 5th birthday, a statistic so far removed from contemporary experience that it can be hard to fully absorb. Entire families buried multiple children before any of them reached adulthood, an experience common enough that it shaped Victorian culture, religion, and personal correspondence in ways that feel, from a modern vantage point, almost unbearably sad. Why so high, specifically, and why does it connect so directly to everything already covered in this series? Because infants and young children sit at the exact intersection of nearly every hygiene failure explored so far, with almost none of the resilience adults might have to survive those failures. Start with water, the very first subject this entire story opened on. Contaminated water, as we've already established, was a persistent, often invisible danger throughout Victorian cities, particularly in poorer neighborhoods where cesspits sat close to shallow wells and shared pumps. Adults exposed to contaminated water might become seriously ill, sometimes fatally so, but they generally had more physical resilience to fight off infection than an infant's immature immune system could manage. Diarrheal disease, caused overwhelmingly by exactly the kind of water contamination explored in earlier chapters, was a leading cause of infant death throughout this period, a devastating, largely preventable cause once its true source was understood, but one that claimed an enormous number of young lives throughout the decades when miasma theory still dominated medical thinking and contaminated water continued flowing, unrecognized, into homes and feeding bottles alike. Feeding itself carried enormous hygiene risk in an era before reliable refrigeration, sterilization, or a clear understanding of bacterial contamination. Breastfeeding, when a mother was healthy and able, remained the safest option available throughout this period. Though even this wasn't universally possible given maternal health conditions, the demands of factory labor that pulled many working-class mothers away from their infants for long stretches of the day, and social conventions among some wealthier families that favored wet nurses or early weaning. When breastfeeding wasn't possible or wasn't chosen, alternative feeding methods carried genuinely severe risk. Milk substitutes, often based on cow's milk mixed with water, sugar, or other additives, were frequently prepared and stored without any real understanding of bacterial contamination, using water that, as already established, was itself often unsafe and stored in conditions with no refrigeration to slow bacterial growth in a warm, humid nursery. Feeding bottles themselves deserve particular attention here, because one design in particular, widely used and heavily marketed throughout much of the Victorian era, turned out to be a devastating public health hazard, discovered only gradually as understanding of bacterial contamination improved. This design incorporated a long rubber tube connecting the bottle to the nipple, intended to allow an infant to feed somewhat independently without requiring constant adult supervision, a genuinely appealing convenience for overworked mothers managing households, other children, and often paid labor simultaneously. The problem, discovered only after considerable harm had already been done, was that the long internal tube was nearly impossible to clean thoroughly with the cleaning tools and understanding available at the time, creating an ideal environment for bacterial growth that then delivered contaminated milk directly to an infant with every single feeding. This particular device is worth spelling out because it captures, in miniature, the entire tragedy running through this chapter and this series as a whole. Not neglect. Parents using this feeding bottle were, by every intention and every standard understanding available to them at the time, trying to care for their children as responsibly as possible, using a product marketed and sold specifically as a modern, practical solution for busy households. The genuine danger hidden inside it, invisible without the scientific understanding of bacterial contamination that wouldn't fully develop and spread until later in the century, meant that careful, loving parents could unknowingly expose their infants to serious, sometimes fatal illness through a product they had every reason to trust. Layer onto this the housing conditions explored in earlier chapters: overcrowded tenement buildings, poor ventilation, proximity to overflowing cesspits and contaminated water sources, and infants growing up in the poorest Victorian neighborhoods faced a brutal combination of risk factors, almost none of which they had any ability to protect themselves against. Older children and adults could, at least in theory, exercise some judgment about which water to drink, which areas to avoid, how carefully to wash their hands before eating. Infants had none of that agency. Their survival depended entirely on the hygiene knowledge, resources, and circumstances of the adults caring for them. And in the poorest neighborhoods, all three of those factors were working against them simultaneously. It's worth saying plainly, too, that this crisis was not evenly distributed, following the same class patterns already established throughout this entire series. Wealthier families, with access to cleaner water, better housing, more reliable food storage, and often the ability to employ dedicated nursery staff specifically trained in infant care, saw meaningfully lower infant mortality rates than poorer families living in crowded urban tenements. This gap wasn't due to wealthier parents caring more about their children. It reflected, once again, the same pattern of unequal access to the basic infrastructure of hygiene, clean water, adequate housing, reliable food, that has run through every single chapter of this story so far. Grief over a lost child cut across every social class in Victorian society. The likelihood of experiencing that grief did not. Victorian parents, it's important to understand, were not passive or indifferent in the face of these risks. Enormous cultural energy went into protecting infant health, expressed through an elaborate set of domestic rituals and practices, many rooted in genuine, if sometimes scientifically incomplete, understanding of hygiene. Mothers were instructed extensively through popular domestic advice literature that circulated widely during this period on the importance of clean water for infant feeding, regular washing of infant clothing and bedding, careful attention to ventilation in nursery rooms, and prompt medical attention at the first sign of illness. These instructions reflected genuine concern and genuine effort, even when the underlying scientific understanding of exactly why certain practices mattered remained incomplete or, in some cases, simply wrong. There's something genuinely moving in reading through Victorian domestic advice manuals from this period, in seeing just how much careful, anxious attention was poured into protecting infant health, even while the surrounding infrastructure, contaminated water, inadequate sanitation, dangerous feeding equipment, worked so persistently against those efforts. Parents were not failing through carelessness. They were fighting, with real dedication and real love, against a set of physical and scientific limitations that were, for most of the century, simply beyond their ability to fully overcome, regardless of how carefully they followed every piece of advice available to them. The improvement, when it finally began arriving in the final decades of the Victorian era, tracked closely alongside everything explored in earlier chapters of this series. Expanding sewer infrastructure, reducing water contamination, cheaper and more widely available soap, improving general hygiene standards, and, most significantly, the slow but eventually decisive shift from miasma theory toward genuine germ theory, which finally gave parents, doctors, and public health officials an accurate understanding of exactly what was making infants sick and, crucially, what could be done to prevent it. Infant mortality rates, while remaining tragically high by modern standards throughout the remainder of the century, did begin a genuine, measurable decline in the final Victorian decades, a decline that would continue and accelerate well into the following century as scientific understanding, public infrastructure, and medical practice all continued advancing together. This chapter has been, deliberately, one of the heaviest in this entire story, because it's important not to look away from what was, for a huge number of Victorian families, the most devastating consequence of everything explored throughout this series. But the story does continue to turn, and the next chapter offers a genuinely different vantage point on all of this. A look at how the wealthiest Victorian households managed to sidestep a considerable portion of the risk explored in this chapter, not through better luck, but through resources, staff, and infrastructure that remained entirely out of reach for the families whose stories we've just walked through. What did hygiene actually look like at the very top of Victorian society, and what, exactly, did it take, in terms of labor and staff, to make that level of cleanliness possible? That is where we turn next. Everything explored so far in this story has been shaped by scarcity, of water, of fuel, of time, of money. But there was another Victorian world running alongside this one, occupying the same cities and often the very same streets, where nearly every one of those scarcities simply didn't apply in the same way. This chapter turns to that world, the wealthy households of Victorian Britain, and the elaborate systems of labor required to keep them clean. Start with water, since it's been the foundation of nearly everything covered in this story so far. A wealthy Victorian household didn't send a family member out to a shared pump with a bucket. It employed servants specifically to manage water, hauling it from whatever source the house relied on, heating it over dedicated kitchen fires kept burning throughout the day, and carrying it up multiple flights of stairs to bedrooms and dressing rooms where baths were taken in private. As the century progressed and indoor plumbing gradually spread among wealthier homes, some of this labor shifted from human hauling toward pipe delivery, but even households with early plumbing systems typically still required staff to manage water heating, since dedicated hot water systems remained a later development that many wealthy Victorian homes still lacked for a significant portion of the century. This meant that daily, sometimes twice daily, bathing, a level of hygiene genuinely comparable to modern expectations, was achievable for wealthy Victorians in a way that was simply out of reach for the working-class families explored in earlier chapters. A full household of live-in servants, sometimes numbering a dozen or more in the largest homes, existed in significant part to make this kind of consistent, labor-intensive personal cleanliness possible for the family they served. Ladies' maids and valets managed not just bathing but the entire elaborate process of dressing, a task considerably more involved than simply putting on clothes, particularly for women, whose fashionable garments of the period often required assistance simply to fasten correctly. Clothing itself tells the same story of resource advantage playing out across nearly every subject already covered in this series. Where a working-class family, as explored in an earlier chapter, might own only a few changes of undergarments and wash outer garments only a handful of times per year, a wealthy household maintained extensive wardrobes, allowing genuine daily rotation between garments and giving laundered clothing time to properly dry and air between wears. Laundry itself, rather than being an exhausting weekly ordeal falling on an already overworked mother, was handled by dedicated laundry staff, sometimes an entire separate department of household servants, working in purpose-built laundry rooms equipped with better tools and more reliable access to hot water than any working-class household could hope to match. This meant that the genuine hygiene advantage enjoyed by wealthy Victorians wasn't simply about appearance, the visible performance of respectability explored in the opening chapter of this story. It was backed by real, measurable differences in actual physical cleanliness. Cleaner skin, cleaner clothing worn closer to the body, less accumulated odor and residue, considerably lower exposure to the parasites and skin conditions that plague poorer households living in the conditions explored in earlier chapters. Dental care followed a similar pattern. Wealthy families could afford more skilled dental practitioners, higher quality tooth powders, and eventually toothpaste formulations. And, when tooth loss did occur, considerably better false teeth crafted from superior materials. This didn't eliminate dental problems entirely. Since the underlying dietary and scientific limitations explored in the earlier chapter on Victorian teeth affected the wealthy, as well as the poor, sugar consumption rose across every social class during this period, and the precise mechanisms of tooth decay remained poorly understood regardless of wealth. But better access to care and the ability to address problems earlier and more effectively meaningfully softened the impact for those who could afford it. Housing itself created enormous hygiene advantages that had nothing to do with personal bathing habits at all. Wealthy Victorian homes were larger, better ventilated, and situated, in many cases quite deliberately, further from the crowded, poorly drained neighborhoods where cesspits, contaminated wells, and industrial pollution concentrated most heavily. This wasn't accidental. As understanding of public health risk grew over the course of the century, even before full acceptance of germ theory, wealthier families increasingly used their financial resources to physically distance themselves from the neighborhoods carrying the greatest hygiene-related risk, a pattern of spatial inequality that echoes forward into modern urban geography in ways still visible today. The nursery practices explored in the previous chapter, so devastating for working-class families lacking clean water and safe feeding equipment, look considerably different in wealthy households. Infants born into wealthy families were often cared for by dedicated nursery staff, trained specifically in infant hygiene and feeding practices, working with cleaner water, better food storage, and considerably more attentive, resource-rich supervision than an overworked working-class mother managing multiple children alongside paid labor could typically provide. Wealthy infant mortality rates, while still higher than modern standards given the genuine scientific limitations of the era that affected every social class, remained meaningfully lower than the rates devastating the poorest urban neighborhoods. It would be a mistake, though, to read this chapter as simply a story of wealthy Victorians effortlessly avoiding every hygiene problem explored throughout this series. Wealth bought considerable protection, but it didn't buy complete immunity, and it's worth pausing on about where that protection broke down. Wealthy households still drew water, in many cases, from the same contaminated municipal sources feeding the rest of the city, before the major sewer reforms explored 2 chapters ago finally began separating drinking water from sewage contamination on a citywide basis. Cholera and other waterborne illnesses, while striking poor neighborhoods with disproportionate severity, did not respect class boundaries entirely, and wealthy households experienced their own share of tragedy during the major outbreaks that punctuated the Victorian era. Social gatherings, too, created genuine exposure risk that money couldn't fully insulate against. Crowded theaters, churches, and social events brought wealthy Victorians into close proximity with people from considerably less hygienic circumstances, and diseases spreading through direct contact, rather than water or food, didn't particularly care about the social status of whoever they infected next. Domestic servants, moving daily between their own often crowded, poorly resourced living conditions and their employers' households, represented another genuine point of exposure that wealth alone couldn't eliminate, since servants themselves often lived in circumstances far closer to the working-class conditions explored throughout this story than to the comfortable households they worked within. What emerges from all of this, when placed alongside everything explored in the preceding chapters, is a genuinely useful, if uncomfortable, way to understand Victorian hygiene as a whole. It wasn't a single, uniform experience shared equally across an entire society. It was a resource distributed as unevenly as wealth itself, with genuine, measurable consequences for health, comfort, and survival stacked at every level. The elaborate rituals of the wealthy, the daily baths, the extensive wardrobes, the dedicated nursery staff, weren't simply about luxury or vanity, even though they were certainly also that. They represented, in very concrete terms, a genuine buffer against risks that were, for the working-class families explored throughout most of this story, simply unavoidable given the resources available to them. This sets up perfectly the turn this story takes next, because everything explored so far, the water, the bathing, the clothing, the disease theory, the soap industry, the infant mortality crisis, the class divide and access to cleanliness, was about to be transformed by a single scientific shift more significant than anything else covered in this entire series. The moment germ theory finally, decisively displaced miasma thinking within mainstream medicine didn't just correct an abstract scientific error. It changed how surgery was performed, how illness was diagnosed and treated, how public health policy was designed, and, eventually, how ordinary households across every social class understood the basic, practical relationship between washing and staying alive. That transformation, and the specific scientific breakthroughs that finally made it undeniable, is where this story turns next. Every story needs a turning point, a moment where everything that came before starts making sense in a completely new light. And this is that moment in the story of Victorian hygiene. For most of the century explored throughout this series, disease had been fought largely blind, guided by a theory, miasma, that got some things right by accident while missing the actual mechanism of contagion entirely. This chapter is about the slow, hard-won process of finally seeing the enemy clearly, and what changed once Victorian society finally did. The shift didn't happen in a single dramatic moment, however satisfying that version of the story might be to tell. It happened through a series of separate, painstaking scientific breakthroughs, developed independently across different countries and different fields of study, that gradually converged into a single, coherent, and ultimately undeniable picture. Specific diseases were caused by specific microorganisms, invisible to the naked eye but entirely real, that could be transmitted from person to person, from contaminated water or food into the body, and from unclean hands or instruments directly into open wounds. One crucial thread of this story runs through the world of fermentation and decay, seemingly a world away from human disease at first glance, but ultimately foundational to everything that followed. Careful laboratory research during the middle decades of the century demonstrated, through repeated, controlled experimentation, that fermentation and spoilage weren't simply the result of spontaneous chemical processes, as had long been assumed, but were caused by living microorganisms actively present in the material being studied. This finding, while emerging from research into wine, beer, and food spoilage rather than human illness directly, carried enormous implications once researchers began asking an obvious next question. If microorganisms could cause fermentation and spoilage in food and drink, could similar organisms be responsible for disease in the human body as well? A second crucial thread ran through the world of surgery, and it's worth walking through this piece of the story slowly, because it connects so directly to everything explored throughout this series about hygiene, water, and physical cleanliness. Surgical practice throughout most of the Victorian era operated with essentially no understanding of the risk posed by unsterilized instruments, unwashed hands, or contaminated operating environments. Surgeons frequently moved directly from one procedure to another, or even from examining a diseased patient to performing surgery on a different patient entirely, without any real cleaning of hands or instruments in between, because the underlying danger of doing so simply wasn't understood within the medical framework of the time. Surgical mortality from post-operative infection was devastatingly high throughout this period, a grim, largely accepted cost of medical intervention that claimed a significant portion of surgical patients regardless of how technically skilled the surgeon performing the procedure happened to be. The breakthrough that changed this came from a surgeon who took the emerging research on microorganisms seriously enough to test whether it might explain the persistent, seemingly unavoidable infection rates plaguing surgical practice. Drawing directly on the fermentation research already underway elsewhere, this surgeon began experimenting with antiseptic techniques during operations, using a chemical compound applied to wounds, surgical instruments, and the surrounding operating environment specifically intended to kill the microorganisms increasingly suspected of causing post-operative infection. The results, when carefully documented and compared against traditional surgical practice, were striking. Patients treated with these antiseptic techniques showed dramatically lower rates of infection and postoperative death compared to those treated under conventional methods. This is worth a closer look because it represents one of the clearest, most direct pieces of evidence connecting hygiene, in this specific case surgical cleanliness, to measurable life or death outcomes. Evidence considerably more visible and immediate than the slower, more diffuse patterns of waterborne disease explored in earlier chapters. A surgeon using antiseptic technique versus one who wasn't produced dramatically different survival rates in patients undergoing comparable procedures. That kind of stark, repeatable, life and death contrast is exactly the sort of evidence that even the most skeptical members of the medical establishment eventually found difficult to keep dismissing. And yet, even with this evidence in hand, the adoption of antiseptic surgical technique faced real, sustained resistance within the broader medical community for years. Established surgeons, trained under the old assumptions and confident in their existing methods, were often reluctant to adopt a practice that implicitly suggested their prior work, and the deaths that had resulted from it, might have been preventable all along. This resistance is worth understanding not simply as stubbornness, though there was certainly some of that involved, but as a genuinely human response to being asked to fundamentally reconsider deeply held professional assumptions built up over an entire career. Change, even change backed by strong evidence, moves slowly through institutions built around confidence in existing expertise. What eventually broke this resistance down wasn't a single dramatic event, but the same slow accumulation of evidence that characterizes most of this story. As more surgeons cautiously adopted antiseptic technique and reported similarly dramatic improvements in patient survival, and as the underlying microorganism research continued strengthening in parallel through work happening across multiple countries and multiple research institutions, the weight of evidence eventually became impossible to responsibly ignore. By the final decades of the Victorian era, antiseptic and increasingly aseptic surgical technique, involving not just killing germs already present, but preventing their introduction in the first place through thoroughly sterilized instruments and environments, had become the accepted standard across the medical profession, transforming surgical survival rates in a way that stands as one of the most significant, measurable medical achievements of the entire 19th century. Beyond surgery, this same body of emerging research began transforming how physicians and public health officials understood disease transmission more broadly, finally providing the missing piece that made sense of evidence that miasma theory had never adequately explained. The cholera outbreak, explored several chapters ago, traced painstakingly to a single contaminated pump through careful mapping rather than laboratory science, suddenly made complete sense within this new framework. It wasn't foul air causing the outbreak. It was a specific, identifiable microorganism, present in contaminated water, causing illness exactly the way researchers were now demonstrating that other organisms caused other diseases, reproducibly, in controlled laboratory conditions. This new understanding rippled outward into nearly every subject explored throughout this entire story, retroactively explaining patterns that had puzzled observers for decades. The concentration of disease in poor, overcrowded neighborhoods, previously attributed to bad air and general foulness, was now understood in terms of contaminated water sources, inadequate sanitation, and close physical proximity enabling direct transmission between infected individuals. The devastating infant mortality explored 2 chapters ago, previously understood only vaguely in terms of general unhealthiness and poor constitution, was now understood specifically in terms of contaminated feeding water, unsterilized feeding equipment, and preventable bacterial infection, opening a clear, actionable path toward genuine prevention that simply hadn't existed under the old framework. Public health policy itself began shifting accordingly, moving away from measures aimed primarily at eliminating bad smells and toward measures specifically targeting the actual mechanisms of disease transmission now being identified through laboratory research. Water treatment and filtration, already improving gradually for infrastructure reasons explored in an earlier chapter, gained new scientific justification and urgency once officials understood precisely what they were filtering out and why it mattered. Hand washing, food handling practices, and general standards of cleanliness in hospitals, nurseries, and households began to be understood and promoted based on genuine scientific mechanism rather than inherited habit or vague moral association with respectability. This transformation extended even into the soap industry explored a few chapters back, which had spent decades marketing cleanliness primarily through appeals to morality, respectability, and social status. As germ theory spread through public understanding, advertising and public health messaging alike increasingly incorporated genuine scientific language, framing soap and washing not just as markers of respectable living, but as genuinely, scientifically effective tools against specific, identifiable disease-causing organisms. The commerce and public health forces that had already been pushing loosely in the same direction, as explored in that earlier chapter, now had a shared, scientifically grounded vocabulary to describe exactly why their shared message mattered. It's worth stepping back at this point in the story to appreciate just how significant this shift was, not just for the remaining years of the Victorian era, but for everything that followed it. Nearly every subject explored throughout this entire series, water contamination, infrequent bathing, reused and unwashed clothing, dental neglect, inadequate sanitation, devastating infant mortality, had been shaped, directly or indirectly, by a Victorian society operating without an accurate understanding of what actually caused disease. The arrival of germ theory didn't instantly fix any of these problems on its own. Real change still required infrastructure, resources, and time, exactly the forces explored throughout the rest of this story. But it finally gave Victorian society, for the first time in the entire century, an accurate map of the actual enemy it had been fighting all along, replacing decades of educated guesswork with genuine, actionable scientific understanding. That understanding, arriving as it did in the final decades of the Victorian era, set the stage for the transformation explored in this story's final chapter. The slow, genuinely remarkable rebuilding of the modern city around principles of sanitation and public health that we now take almost entirely for granted, and the surprising, lasting legacy that this entire difficult, uneven Victorian struggle for cleanliness still carries into how we live today. That is where this story concludes. We've spent 11 chapters walking through a version of the Victorian era that rarely makes it into popular imagination. Not the glittering ballrooms and perfectly pressed collars, but the scarce water, the shared bathwater, the reused undergarments, the decaying teeth, the overflowing cesspits, the wrong theory of disease, and the devastating cost all of it exacted, disproportionately, on the poorest members of society and their most vulnerable children. It's time now to bring this story to where it was always heading. The genuine, hard-won transformation that finally began closing the gap between the appearance of cleanliness explored in the very first chapter and the real, physical cleanliness that had remained so persistently out of reach for so much of the century. By the final 2 or 3 decades of the Victorian era, nearly every thread explored throughout this series had begun converging into genuine, measurable improvement, arriving unevenly, arriving too slowly for the generations who had already lived and died under the older conditions, but arriving nonetheless in a way that fundamentally reshaped how ordinary people lived. Start with sanitation infrastructure, since it's been such a persistent thread throughout this entire story. The sewer systems explored several chapters back, initially built following the crisis that made a river unbearable to sit near, expanded considerably over the following decades, gradually reaching further into working-class neighborhoods that had been left behind in the earliest phases of construction. This expansion didn't happen instantly or evenly. Poorer and more peripheral neighborhoods continued waiting years, sometimes decades, longer than wealthier central districts. But the overall trajectory across the final Victorian decades was genuinely and measurably positive. Cesspits, the source of so much contamination explored throughout this series, gradually became less common as proper sewer connections spread, reducing the proximity between human waste and drinking water that had driven so much of the disease burden covered in earlier chapters. Water infrastructure improved alongside sanitation, with cities investing in better filtration, cleaner source reservoirs, and eventually piped water reaching directly into individual homes rather than requiring the shared pumps and water carriers explored in the second chapter of this story. This transformation, arriving as it did alongside genuine scientific understanding of exactly why contaminated water mattered, represented one of the most significant, life-saving infrastructure achievements of the entire Victorian period, directly addressing the root cause behind cholera outbreaks, infant mortality from diarrheal disease, and a considerable portion of the general illness burden that had shaped so much of ordinary Victorian life throughout the earlier decades explored in this series. Housing itself began, gradually, to improve as well, though this particular thread moved more slowly and unevenly than water and sanitation infrastructure. Public health reformers, increasingly armed with the scientific credibility that germ theory provided, pushed for building regulations addressing overcrowding, ventilation, and basic sanitary facilities within working-class housing. A difficult political fight given the financial interests of landlords profiting from densely packed, poorly maintained tenement buildings. Progress here was real but partial by the century's end, with genuine housing reform continuing to unfold well into the following century rather than reaching completion within the Victorian era itself. Soap and personal hygiene products, as explored in an earlier chapter, continued becoming cheaper, gentler, and more widely available, and cultural expectations around washing frequency shifted accordingly. Daily or near-daily washing, once genuinely unreachable for most working-class households given the labor and expense explored in the third chapter of this story, gradually became more achievable as water access improved, soap prices fell, and public health messaging, now backed by genuine scientific understanding, reinforced the practical importance of frequent washing in preventing illness rather than simply maintaining respectable appearance. Medical practice transformed dramatically as well, building on the germ theory breakthroughs explored in the previous chapter. Hospitals began adopting increasingly rigorous standards of cleanliness and sterilization, dramatically reducing the post-operative infection rates that had claimed so many surgical patients throughout the earlier decades of the century. Public health officials, no longer chasing bad smells under the old miasma framework, began targeting the actual, identifiable sources of disease transmission, water contamination, unsanitary food handling, inadequate waste disposal, with policies grounded in genuine scientific understanding rather than educated guesswork. Infant mortality, the devastating subject explored 2 chapters back, began its own genuine, sustained decline during these final Victorian decades, though it remained tragically high by modern standards well into the following century. Improved water quality, better understanding of safe infant feeding practices, and gradually improving housing conditions all contributed to this decline, offering, finally, some measure of the protection that wealthy families had always been able to access, extending slowly, unevenly, but genuinely, toward working-class families as well. It's worth sitting with for a second, in this final chapter, about exactly what kind of story this ultimately is, because it resists the neat, triumphant narrative arc that popular history sometimes prefers. This isn't a story where a single breakthrough instantly fixed a century of hardship. It's a story of accumulated, overlapping struggle, water scarcity colliding with expensive fuel, colliding with an incorrect theory of disease, colliding with rigid class structures that concentrated risk and hardship most heavily on those least equipped to survive it. All of it slowly, unevenly untangled over the better part of a century, through a combination of genuine scientific progress, hard-won infrastructure investment, and continued, persistent inequality that meant improvement always arrived first, and most completely, for those who already had the most resources to begin with. And yet, for all its unevenness, the trajectory across this entire story is remarkable when you step back and look at the full span of it. A society that began the 19th century relying on shared wells, chamber pots, and a fundamentally mistaken theory of disease ended it with expanding sewer systems, increasingly reliable piped water, genuine scientific understanding of contagion, and hospitals practicing sterile surgical technique that would be recognizably related to modern medical practice. That transformation, uneven and incomplete as it remained even by the century's close, laid the direct foundation for the public health infrastructure that most of us now live inside without ever having to think about it. Water we can trust without a second thought, sanitation systems we never have to consider, medical practice grounded in genuine understanding of what causes illness. There's a particular insight worth carrying away from this entire 12-chapter journey, one that connects directly back to where this story began. The gap explored in that very first chapter, between how clean Victorians appeared and how clean they actually were, wasn't a story about vanity or deception or a society failing to care about something it should have cared about more. It was a story about a society doing everything within its power to project the values it genuinely held: cleanliness, respectability, care for one's family and community, while working within physical and scientific constraints that made those values difficult to fully achieve in daily practice. The lace collars and white gloves explored at the very start of this story weren't a performance covering up indifference. They were a performance covering up struggle, an entire society reaching, as best it could, toward a standard that the century's actual infrastructure and scientific understanding simply hadn't yet caught up to. That gap between aspiration and capability, between what a society values and what it can achieve given the tools and knowledge available to it at any given moment, isn't unique to the Victorians. It's worth spelling out, quietly, as a pattern that likely continues shaping our own era in ways we won't fully recognize until enough time and enough scientific progress has passed to let us look back and see clearly. The Victorians believed, with complete sincerity, that they understood what caused disease, right up until the evidence became undeniable that they didn't. It's worth wondering, gently and without alarm, what assumptions we're currently building our own lives around with similar confidence, waiting for their own eventual correction. If this story of scarce water, shared bathwater, and the long, uneven climb toward genuine cleanliness gave you something to sit with tonight, let it settle slowly. Somewhere in a crowded 19th century tenement, a mother was heating a single basin of water over a coal fire, preparing to bathe her family in careful sequence, doing everything within her power, with the knowledge and resources available to her, to keep the people she loved safe and clean in a world that made both of those things far harder than they ever should have been. If you'd like to keep drifting through history at this same slow, careful pace, subscribe to the Sleepy Archive and let the past keep telling itself, quietly, until you fall asleep.